Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our session entitled Leveraging AI for Psychiatric Research, Natural Language Processing to Assess Loneliness in Older Adults. My name is Ellen Lee, and I'll be presenting with Dr. Varsha Badal on behalf of our group at the UC San Diego IBM Center for AI for Healthy Living. Today, we'll be talking about the opportunities of AI for psychiatric research. We will illustrate one proof of concept study in loneliness. We will then discuss the limitations of ground truth for psychological constructs, how to examine language and speech data for behavioral concepts. We will talk about the limitations of applying AI tools for psychiatric research. And last, we will talk about the potential for AI in better understanding loneliness. There are some key challenges in mental health care for which AI could be a solution. First is the detection of mental illnesses. There are no objective criteria for diagnoses, and the disorders themselves are heterogeneous in etiology and manifestation. Comorbidities like having two or more mental illnesses are very common. And in the past, we have lacked objective criteria for specific behaviors like sleep, social activities, and so on, and have relied primarily on patients' recall. Next, we have the challenges in treating mental illnesses. There are relatively poor response rates to most pharmacotherapies. About a third of patients respond to an antidepressant trial. Due to the wide heterogeneity of treatment responses, possibly due to the heterogeneous diagnostic criteria, we often lack a clear and personalized algorithm for treatment. And last, the social environment plays a crucial role in psychiatry. Social isolation, social support, stigma, poverty, and the lack of mental health resources greatly impact the outcomes of mental illnesses. These complex problems present great opportunity for AI, which with large, diverse data sets with multimodal data streams could personalize the diagnosis, treatment, and understanding of mental illness. Now I will switch gears to talk more about the problem of loneliness itself. The behavioral epidemic of loneliness has gained growing media attention with the steep increase of empirical studies over the past decades, as well as the rise in social isolation, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Loneliness is defined as a distress arising from a discrepancy between perceived and desired social relationships. 162,000 deaths per year in the US alone are attributable to social isolation, which is more than that from lung cancer or stroke. Older adults are at particular high risk for loneliness, where 2/3 of older adults are affected. And the downstream adverse health consequences of loneliness outweigh the impact of obesity and smoking 15 cigarettes per day. Thus, loneliness is a growing, important, and potentially addressable problem among older adults. However, our understanding of the subjective state is limited by the current qualitative study methods, which usually examine the broad, overarching themes expressed by a group of 20 to 30 individuals. AI can help us understand the personal experience of loneliness and how it is expressed by many individuals. Our proof of concept study aimed to use NLP to better understand how older adults talk about loneliness using semi-structured interviews. The sample size for the study included 80 older adults with a mean age of 83 years, and 64% of the sample were women. In the sample, 37% of the group had moderate to high levels of loneliness based on the UCLA-3 loneliness scale score. This is one of the gold standard self-report assessments of loneliness. The participants completed semi-structured qualitative interviews for 1.5 to 2.5 hours, covering topics including loneliness, wisdom, successful aging, and attitudes towards technology. The interviews were audio taped and transcribed. And the interviews are structured as follows. Q1 or question 1 is the first question asked of all participants. Do you ever feel lonely, and if so, how often? If the participant responds with yes, I feel lonely, then they are asked Q2 or question 2. What does loneliness feel like to you? If the participant says no, I don't feel lonely to question 1, then they are asked question 3. Why do you think others may feel lonely? Now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Varsha Badal to talk about the rest of our study results.
Thank you, Dr. Ellen Lee. Let's see what can be inferred from speech data. Speakers' gender and age. Female and children's voice have higher pitch. Speakers' native languages have unique sounds, accents, and intonations. Speakers non-verbally expressed emotion, intonation, tone, excitement. Speakers verbally express thoughts, say how they're feeling, good, bad, and what they're doing. Speakers' thought process, cohesion across sentences, relevance. Speakers' sense of self that can be interpreted by examining the usage of personal pronoun. Once the speech is transcribed, we will lose some of the contents, example 1 through 3. So how can we go about analyzing emotions? Explicitly listed emotions, I'm sad, it made me happy, dictionary based. Interpreting emotions, indirect association between words, example death, accident, party, and celebrate. More elaborate approaches such as WordNet, word embeddings. Machine learning, example sentences labeled by emotions expressed. We can train a neural network to output expressed emotions where the features are word vectors. Semi-structured interviews to itemize numeric responses convey more information, however, they require further interpretation. Some interviews that have differential flow based on subject responses incorporate real-time judgment of the interviewer in terms of set of questions that are actually asked. Due to certain predetermined questions, the transcript can be analyzed for relevant content using IR techniques, that is information retrieval techniques, like TF-IDF, term frequency, inverse document frequency. In TF-IDF terminology, each transcript is a corpus. Each question, in our case, preceded by Q:, is a document. Once the question has been identified, we extract the following response. The response text is sent to IBM NLU service for sentiment and emotion analysis. The sentiment is typically a positive or a negative value depending upon extent of agreement or disagreement. Emotions are strength of components between 0 to 1, or fear, disgust, sad, joy, and anger. These components can be analyzed and used as features for machine learning. So such interviews are very suitable for analysis using NLP. I would say for any large-scale study, NLP becomes imperative. Here we are exploring the responses to question 1. Do you ever feel lonely, and if so, how often? We expect subject responses to Q1 will mirror the emotions associated with loneliness. Emotional composition of response to loneliness, left-hand side, self-assessment or qualitative, and on the right-hand side is the UCLA assessment or the quantitative. We have plotted the median values. Emotion, strength of fear, anger, joy, sad, disgust, etc. in the range of 0 to 1. Based upon IBM responses, we see that sadness and fear seem to be two predominant emotions embedded in loneliness, in qualitative and quantitative loneliness, which seems very plausible. Additionally, quantitative loneliness seems to separate people based on expressed joy. Some of the differences we found: women were more likely to acknowledge feeling lonely in interviews when they were quantitatively lonely compared to men, 76.4% versus 46.1%. Emotions expressed if they were lonely. On the figure, left-hand side figure, distribution of emotions: sadness, joy, fear, disgust, anger in response to question 1 by gender. Emotion is on x-axis, emotion values 0 through 1 on y-axis. Females show higher sadness, male display higher fear. Figure on the right-hand side, distribution of log of length, it is a linear scale of response to question 1 by quantitatively assessed loneliness. The blue and the pink bars are layered on top of each other. Response length is longer for lonely people. What AI can do when studying loneliness? Estimating emotional content and machine learning classification to identify lonely individuals from their interviews. And in future, relationships mentioned and assess social connectivity, important relationships, whether individual feels understood, frequency of communication, etc. Correlations with psychological strength like resilience, optimism, and wisdom. Estimate topical drift in talk. We can estimate sentence theme, and if large changes happen between sentence themes, we can conclude digression between topic. calculate density of personal pronouns. These can be indicative of egocentricity or sense of self-worth. While UCLA-3 is a popular and validated research assessment of loneliness, it has inherent limitations of all self-report measures. Participants may feel inclined to give socially desirable responses, or their recall may be skewed by recent experiences. The UCLA-3 scale does not explicitly use the word lonely, as it aims to assess the scale developer's construct of loneliness. On the other hand, individuals may have a different conceptualization of loneliness, which may be reflected in their qualitative assessment or self-acknowledgement of loneliness within the interview. Last, thus UCLA-3 focuses on loneliness as a trait rather than a state. For some, loneliness may be a transient experience triggered by social rejection or isolation and relieved by companionship or engagement in meaningful activities, while for others, loneliness may be persistent and debilitating state that leads to further social withdrawal. AI techniques are well suited to studying the nuanced nature of loneliness by utilizing longitudinal data and associated changes in behavior and mood. The current study demonstrated the feasibility of using machine learning models for fuzzy psychological constructs such as loneliness. However, there are several limitations. Data was cross-sectional, thus the causal inference is not possible. Longitudinal studies are needed to understand the quality and trajectory of loneliness over time. The sample size was limited to the residents within San Diego housing community, and thus these findings may not be generalizable to other populations. We should be careful that we are using a non-specific NLU tool for analyzing user responses for clinical application. Machine learning are opaque implementations, not easily interpretable or justifiable. Often the process involves several techniques working in conjunction. The mental health field has numerous opportunities for AI. Our findings from proof of concept study are illustrative of how speech data can be used to better understand the nature of fuzzy behavioral constructs like loneliness. However, cultivation of appropriate data sets, clear understanding of ground truth, designations, and co-development of sensitive AI tool are needed to advance the field. We acknowledge AI for healthy living collaboration between UCSD and IBM, Sam and Rose Stein Institute for Research on Aging, UCSD. This work is supported by IBM Research through the AI Horizons Network. Our Senior Dean and Co-Director of AIHL, Dr. Dilip Jeste, IBM Director for AIHL, Dr. Ho-Cheol Kim, and all our research participants and staff. Thank you.